minute here. For those that have finished, a little harder this time. What? Did I ask a question poorly? Maybe. All right. You can continue if you want there. Really quick, let's review our 17 Bible periods. Let's say those together, please. For the flood, scattering of the people, patriarchs, Exodus, wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest, judges, united kingdom, divided kingdom, Judah alone, Judah in captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, life of Christ, early church, letters to the Christians. Good, we're getting better at that. Um, that's just a good structure to remember where we are in our study, obviously, but as you hear different things that are in Scripture and stories that happen and events that have happened in the past, it's really good to put those in those Bible time periods so you kind of know where it is in the story, who might be involved in those stories, and that sort of thing. All right, so quick review over some of the things that we've already talked about. This is a judgment on Egypt's gods. Exodus 12 tells us that. Numbers 33 tells us that. God is very intentionally going after those gods that the Egyptians trusted. And while the Bible does not specifically tie plagues to their gods, there are some assumptions that you can make about what the Egyptians might have been thinking, right? Water to blood would have been directly, at least in my mind, if I'm an Egyptian, an attack on the god of the Nile. All right, and those plagues can be tied. And there's the chart there. Probably difficult to read for most, but that's the sort of thing I think that if I was an Egyptian, I would be thinking about. Hey, how did God bring about darkness? Right? We have, and by the way, in lots of cultures, the sun was a very sacred thing that they very quickly would tie to deity because their life literally depended on the sun. All right, if the sun goes away and you trusted in this God to provide sun and life and warmth and all that stuff, what do you think? Where's my God? Where is that God that is provided so faithfully? Something's awry here. And I think the Egyptians would have obviously been thinking that sort of thing.
I remember looking up some of the gods online, and they have found little artifacts of the frog god, and they would find statues of frogs, and then they'd also have, because it was a god of fertility, they would have a pregnant woman, and the pregnant woman would have a head of a frog. You'd see it in their walls, their paintings, and even figurines. So I can only imagine that if you were a worshiper of all these gods and you were pregnant, you'd probably have one of those up on your mantle. They were ugly.
And the Israelites were special. We've talked about this before. Their God revealed himself to them. All right, these pagan cultures, while there seemed to be some standard of morality that God expected out of them, we don't need to get into that necessarily. But they're kind of guessing at the deities that they have to appease through sacrifice and through this service that they're just guessing. How do I appease this God? And so that's why you end up with this polytheist society where there's a lot of gods and there's a lot of quote unquote deities that you trust in for different things. And Egypt was no different that way. All right, really quickly, we should hopefully remember some of these. What are the two reasons we talked about for God to perform the plagues in Egypt? All right, good. For God to show who he was to the Israelites. They hopefully had a little better idea, but they needed a reminder, I think. All right, and for God to show himself to the Egyptians, that there's a God in Israel, and there, to quote the Lord, there is no one like me in all the earth. think they're going to get the message here. All right. So what in retrospect should we get out of studying about these plagues? Remember, as Philip has emphasized, this is not some story or fairy tale or some fictitious novel that some creative person has come up with. It's hard for us to imagine because we haven't put our hands on anything like this. But this happened. It was tangible to the people then, and certainly was done to prove a point. We should come out of it with the appreciation of who God is and his power. And again, this wasn't supposed to be an event that happened and the Israelites were to forget about it. What did God instruct them to do? Talk about that. Tell of the deliverance that the Lord did for you in Egypt, how you crossed the Red Sea on dry land. And it's a point of faith and encouragement, and it should have been for the Israelites. All right, Zach. And this is not some power that God once had. God is going to melt the elements with fervent heat. He still got the power. I haven't seen plagues like this to this level in my lifetime, but he still has the ability to do so. And just that alone, a being that contains this kind of power, let alone how merciful and gracious he is, the fact that he sent his son to die for us, leave that aside, this is worth respect. And that's the kind of appreciation we should come out of. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, we'll get into
Absolutely.
it. We'll get into it a little bit tonight, but God said, I could have taken you out with one thing. I could have, but I didn't because I wanted to show my
Well,
glory.
one thing you said as far as how the Israelites were then to teach their children why God did these things, how He delivered them out. Uh, talk about the Passover, talk about the parting of the Red Sea. That's just to instill it into their minds that these were actual events. These were historical events that happened. And the further and further you get removed from an event, the harder it is to maybe wrap your hands or your eyes or your beliefs around it. Um, and this is just one point in that storyline, that history, period of history.
That's right. Yep, this is where that idea started. Yep, very good. All right, Lance. Yep, that's right. Yep, and that's our sovereign God who works in ways that we can't fully understand. But he speaks many times of nations whose sin was not yet full. That's not the exact language, but there was a time where judgment needed to be on those nations, and he brought it. All right, really quickly, what's the small phrase? More often than not, when it says Pharaoh hardened his heart, what's the phrase that usually accompanies it at the end? As God had said, or as the Lord had spoke to Moses. God knew this was going to happen, and it should have been a faith builder to Moses. Hey, Moses, he's going to harden his heart. You know why? I told you. Remember that in Midian? Remember when we talked about that? All right.
We talked about, the timeline. The further back things are, the less likely you are to remember them or even accept them. So if you look at where we are in this timeline, you got, here we have us today. Here you have Christ dying on the cross. And then way back here, you have creation. Where are we? We're somewhere around in here. You had the flood, before the flood, our first period, which obviously is talking about creation. But what one other big event happened before the flood? And it's been in this world ever since. Sin, the fall of man. When Adam sinned, it brought death upon us all. And God, from that very point on, had a plan. And he's working his plan all the way through. You see, the flood, because God had there's continual sin with man. Every thought, every desire he had was evil all the days. So God started working his plan. Even then, he was working his plan. He brought flood and destruction, but then we see the scattering of the people because the people were multiplying. They were commanded to multiply, but yet they were not populating the earth. They were all staying in one place. And so God confused the tongues and scattered them. Then you come out to the patriarchal age with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Abraham was he was called out of the land of Ur, and he was given a promise by God, which was what? Threefold promise.
Land, seed, nation.
Land, seed, and nation. You had Abraham, Isaac, his son, then Jacob, his son, who had 12 sons. And then we hear the story of Joseph, who was brought down into Egypt. And God had already foretold this, that they were going to be slaves, told Abraham that. They would be enslaved in a foreign land. So Joseph, we read, there's a lot devoted to Joseph. But he was the one who saved his brothers, his family, and brought them down into Egypt. And that is where we are really tonight. We see the nation of Israel growing, being developed. Before then, it was just a small family. They came down, there was a small group. But now there is a large group. We kind of talked about it before. They were multiplying in the land of Goshen. I kind of jokingly said, about the average household today is 2.5 kids. They didn't have the average household. They probably had multiple children in order to have grown as much as they have in just the short amount of time that they were down in Egypt. But they grew. And here, God calls Moses and tells him his name, which was what? Yahweh, which means the great I am, the one who is, who was, and ever will be. And his goal now is to let the people know who he is, what his name means, that he is the one true living God. And he takes on the different gods of Egypt. Now we only see 10 plagues. But I can assure you that there are a lot more than 10 gods. in Egypt. But these were probably some of the main gods in Egypt. So Moses delivers the message to Pharaoh. Pharaoh just said, "Let my people go." He says, "Let my people go that they may serve me." But Pharaoh's response was, "Absolutely not. Who is this Yahweh that I should obey him?" His arrogance has set in. And we talk about Pharaoh hardening his heart, or God hardening Pharaoh's heart. It wasn't necessarily that God was hardening him. God didn't just pick some random person that was a good moral person and then hardened his heart. It was someone who was arrogant, prideful, and who was not going to bow. And God raised him up for that very purpose, to deliver the people and to show his might and his power. But when he said, "No, I will not obey," I will not let them go. I mentioned this once before, is that Pharaoh had just signed up for a 10-lesson course in just who God was and why you should obey him. Yes, Crawford. Yeah. The only thing that came to my mind when I read that was I was had a hard time speaking it out, right? Okay, so tonight we are in chapter 9, beginning in verse 13, with the 7th plague, which is hail. And I think you probably noticed when you read through all these plagues that they started out kind of mild, really. They were more of a inconvenience or a nuisance, but then they started moving into pain and suffering, and now you're getting to see just the ruin of the nation, the country. It was an economical destruction that's coming about. But God's power over all these deities that the Egyptians had were certainly proclaimed or demonstrated to the Egyptians. Question for you: what message did God command? That's question 1, by the way, if you want to put that up there. What message did God command Moses to give Pharaoh? Speak it a little louder. Let my people go and what? Serve me. Okay? Every time he was saying that, that's what God wanted his people to be able to do, was to serve him. And that's what he wants from us, to serve him. So,
Philip,
yeah.
I noticed something. I don't know how significant this is, but in verse 13, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and say to him.'" Did anybody else notice? I don't know if it's a pattern. I don't know if you want to call it that, but "rise up early in the morning" happened 3 times in an instruction to Moses to go to Pharaoh. It was at plague 1, plague 4, and plague 7. Now, a lot of people try to sort of divide those into 3. I don't know about the significance of that necessarily, but it was something I noticed. Does anybody else come across something? I don't know. Seems like something that God was doing to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, there were no good mornings for Pharaoh. All right. He saw Moses at least 3 mornings. One of the plagues tonight that we'll talk about happened in the morning. There were several things that he's waking up to a terrible day.
I can only imagine when he sees Moses coming, he's like, "Oh no, another bad day." Okay, something here, you might ask, and we mentioned it once before too, about why didn't he just jump to plague number 10? You know, just be over and done with. But there was a reason for that. God is constantly working his plan. And that reason he wouldn't do that was he wanted to prove who he was first, to demonstrate to the Israelites, to demonstrate to the Egyptians, to Pharaoh, and really for us today, the world, who he is, and his great power. Verse 15 says, and I like the way the NIV writes this. It says, for by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. In essence, he's saying, Pharaoh, I've restrained myself thus far. Okay? But it's not looking good for Egypt now. He's about ready to put the hammer down, so to speak, the gauntlet down. But verse 16 says, God has purposefully held back. No one would have been left to demonstrate his power and authority if he had done that. But it was to proclaim. Me too, you know. We know why, though, right? Yeah, God, prevented him from doing that. But, he says that the last plague, or before the Passover, he says, I've lost my train of thought. What's that? Yeah, I mean, you will die. I'll kill you. Why didn't he kill him after the first plague? Or,
Pharaoh was
when he came up in the morning.
Pharaoh was looking to kill Moses when he had killed the Egyptian fighting with the Hebrew, and that's why he had to flee.
That was a different Pharaoh, though.
Correct, but the power in that position.
Yeah. So I wondered the same thing, but obviously God was controlling that situation. But the purpose of it was to certainly to prove to Egypt and Pharaoh who he was, as well as the Israelites. And we kind of talked about it last week. The plague of the flies was the first plague that set apart the children of Israel, the land of Goshen, and the plague did not fall upon them. I believe that the first 3 plagues were on all the land. I could be wrong on that, but I believe that's the case. And God is demonstrating to the people who had doubts after Pharaoh had initially said no, after he cast the staff down and it became a snake. But no matter what times we're in, even in difficult times, God is working his plan. But he warns Pharaoh in verse 18 that hail is about to fall. So, question for you, what's the big deal about hailstorms? I mean, we've all seen hail, right? I can only imagine how big these hailstones were. How many these hailstones were. They were enough to break trees down, kill a person, kill a horse, kill livestock that was left out in the field. It was powerful, but it says that, like nothing they had ever seen since Egypt was a nation. It had never fallen like that before. Yes.
There seems to be other things that go along with these plagues that aren't necessarily recorded in Exodus. In Psalm 78, when talking about the hail, it says, he destroyed their vines with hailstones and their sycamore trees with frost. All right, you might have seen that in the question. He gave over their cattle also to hailstones and their herds to bolts of lightning. So just some additional details about the devastation that happens. It's not just hail. We know that. It's lightning. And later on in this chapter, we'll talk about the rain, the heavy rain stop. So there's a lot going on. So when we think hail, it's a stormy, devastating kind of thing.
Egypt gets very little rainfall in a year's time. Very little. Yet, God calls this storm massive thunderstorm. And it's interesting that word for thunder, the original Hebrew calls it the voice of God. And that's when Pharaoh came back and said, enough of this thunder, enough of this voice of God coming down. And that's the thunder, the lightning. And that's what is really the fire. Yes, Lance? I didn't see lightning in any of the, they call it fire. But yeah, well, Tampa Bay, they say, is the lightning capital of the world. I'm telling you what, I have seen some pretty nasty lightning over Tampa Bay. But this obviously cannot even compare. That could not even compare to what they've seen there. But interestingly enough, where did it not fall? In Goshen, on the children of Israel. But this is the first time that God has given the Egyptians the opportunity to heed his warning of what's going to happen. And he gives them the opportunity to take shelter, bring their livestock in. And so, obviously in verse, I believe it is 20, verse 20, some of them took advantage of that. But there were others, I'm quite sure, that ignored it and were killed by the hail, or a lightning bolt striking them. If they didn't eat it, they would have been killed. How did Pharaoh respond, question 4, to the hail? Verse 27. Yeah. This time I have sinned. Well, yes, you have sinned this time, but you have sinned all the other times as well. But again, he pleads to Moses that he plead to God that it would stop. But he says that the Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. For the sake of time, let me go a little bit here. He asked him to plead with the Lord, for there has been enough of God's thunder. That's the point I was making a minute ago. There's enough of this of hearing God's voice. Unfortunately, Pharaoh's confession that he had sinned was not from the heart, and it was not a true repentance coming from his heart. Verse 34, it says, "But when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned yet again and hardened his heart, he and his servants." And isn't that the case sometimes too often with Christians when things are going terribly wrong? They draw closer to God, but then when things start getting good again, they fall away again. And we have to guard ourselves for that, and we have to guard each other for that, because it is a serious thing. We can fall back into those things. Cycle. We all need to grow and become stronger and stronger in our faith.
All right, so at the end of this plague, verse 35, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. That continues to happen. And he did not let the sons of Israel go, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. I'm going to bring that up every time because I love that phrase is added, because it reminds me, at least as a reader, that God is in control, and I think it did the same for Moses. I do want to read the first 6 verses of chapter 10. I think this is really important in understanding what God wanted us to know about these plagues. It seems that God has given all these plagues. Pharaoh continues to harden his heart. This seems to be the final stage. God's no longer going to kind of continue with this plague after plague after plague, it's time for me to end it. And it's not the last plague now, but he is indicating this is going to, I'm sending them all. Okay? Chapter 10, 1 through 6. And the Lord said to Moses, Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may perform these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and your grandson how I made a mockery of the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. God is pronouncing judgment on Egypt. He's also intending to make a mockery of them. He's looking to embarrass them. The great, powerful nation of Egypt is now going to be brought to its knees. All right, we're gonna get to locusts here in a second. What once possibly, especially around the Nile, would have been this fertile area, there was not a green leaf left. All right, imagine the satellite view. Didn't you mention that in a class? Love to have a satellite view of Egypt before and after the plagues. It would have been a totally different place. God is devastating this nation and this land so that he can save his people. Yes, sir. Yep. If something like that happens, word is going to spread. They don't have Twitter or anything, but word is going to spread. All right? As soon as people leave there and go other places, that's what they're going to be talking about. All right, verses 3 through 6. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your territory. They shall cover the face of the surface of the land, so that no one will be able to see the land. They will also eat the rest of what has escaped. What just happened? The hail. Did it destroy all the crops? No. All right. It specifically mentions two that weren't in bloom or in bud that was going to happen later. So it left some. He's telling Pharaoh, this plague, you think you got some left and you're feeling pretty good about that maybe? This plague's going to remove that. So whatever hope you thought you had in the crops that are coming in the next few weeks, this is it. This will take the rest of them.
But you could humble yourself and it won't come.
That's right. They will also eat the rest of what has escaped, what is left to you from the hail, and they will eat every tree which sprouts for you out of the field. Then your houses will be filled, and the houses of all your servants, and the houses of all the Egyptians, something which neither your fathers nor your grandfathers have seen from the day that they came upon the earth until this day. And he turned and went out from Pharaoh. God is telling Moses and telling Pharaoh, listen, this is going to be bad. The locusts are going to take out every semblance of crops or of food, and it's going to devastate the land. So I asked the question also, the wind that brought the locust in was blowing to the west, blew from the east to the west. All right, I think of where the Red Sea is, right? Because that's where the wind blew them out of Egypt. All right, they came from that same direction. The wind blew to the west from the east, from the Red Sea side of Egypt. And there were so many of them that what? They couldn't see what? We have the darkness plague later, and in verse 21 of 10, it says, nope, that is the darkness plague, sorry. It mentions darkness with the locust, but what was dark? The land. Why was the land dark? The locusts were covering the whole thing. Can you imagine being in a place where the locusts were so abundant that the ground was dark? Everywhere you looked, it was like a carpet of locusts all over the earth.
Every step you took, squash them.
Yeah. The wind, how long did the wind blow that brought them in? All day and all night. So, I'm thinking, how's this working? The locusts are coming in more and more as time progresses. And by the morning, obviously, it's covered, and then it gets into their houses. There's a progression, I think, of the locusts coming in. Just and they're eating everything they can find. I've abandoned the PowerPoint, by the way. I don't know what I've got up there. All right, so what happens now with Pharaoh? By the way, in the book, we don't have time to go over it, but there's a section on page 27 that talks about all the promises and compromises that Pharaoh had in all these plagues. You know, when the frogs came, what was his reaction? And the flies and the locusts. He had these. Yeah, I will let you go, but don't go so far. Or I'll let you go into the wilderness, but again, not too far. Or in the land was the first one. Or I'll let you go just the men, or without the livestock. He's just trying to give partial part of the request that God had made of him.
Appeasing God.
That's right. Nothing green was left on the tree or plant, and Pharaoh said, "What? I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you." All right. Before, with the last plague, it said, "I've sinned against you. The Lord is the righteous one." Crawford brought that up. That's a weird phrase. Oh, yeah, man, I've finally been convinced. The Lord is the righteous one in this situation. Now he says, again, I have sinned against the Lord, but what does he add here? I've sinned against you. All right, I've obviously offended your God. I've offended you. And then what happens after Moses? Yeah, he said he would let the men go only. What happened to Moses and Aaron, though, after this interaction? All right, they were walked out gently. My version says they were driven out of the presence of Pharaoh. Every interaction that Moses and Aaron had, if it's like other normal human reactions, this is getting to be a real problem when Moses and Aaron come around. And this is not some friend that they're upsetting or somebody that maybe can overlook some stuff. This is a powerful king who probably had in his power to command death somehow. I don't think God would let that happen. But they were driven out after this, the locusts.
You know, one important verse in all this too is 7, I think. Pharaoh still doesn't get it because he's got a hardened heart, and it's getting harder and harder and harder. But the people, his servants, are saying in verse 7, then Pharaoh's servants said to him, how long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not understand, Pharaoh? Egypt is ruined. Pharaoh still doesn't get it. He is still that arrogant, prideful, that he doesn't get it.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I missed it, but he's like the last one to relent here. His servants, who were his trusted folks, obviously, and around him all the time, they were saying, what are we doing here? We know the result of this. All right, so what happens at the end of Plague 8? What happens with all the rest of them? Pharaoh hardened his heart, and he did not let Israel go. Now, the Lord tells Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky. And he does so. He stretches his staff out, that darkness would come on the land of Egypt.
And no warning.
Yep. And how long did the darkness last? 3 days. How severe was the darkness? What was the adjective, I guess, that it described the darkness as? All right, darkness you could feel. Have y'all ever been like in a cavern? That's the darkest I've ever been in. I have a feeling this was worse. But going down there and them turning off the flashlights, that is not a comfortable feeling. It's really not, because as the Egyptians did for 3 days, all you can do is sit there. If you just try to get to a place with no reference or anything, you can understand how darkness would be totally discombobulate and disorient you. I couldn't get to that doorway if somebody just sat me down in total darkness. I remember in that cavern, my hand was here. And if you turn off all the lights in this building and it's nighttime, you can still see a little bit. This was the absence of light, it seems like, except for where? And where particularly in Goshen? All right, in the dwellings of the Israelites. What did that look like? That wasn't candles, all right? That wasn't lanterns, I don't think. As I think the book makes the point, as miraculous as the darkness was for 3 days, the light was a miraculous thing too. How does light just happen inside a dwelling? I don't know. But God was making the point, and He was taking care of His people. One point, I don't remember if it was in this book or somewhere else, but with these plagues that were coming on, particularly the hail and the locusts, I guess. I don't think we have any indication in either one of those plagues. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody. But there's no indication that God, talking about the hail and the locusts, that God separated Israel in those. And I think it was this book, but I may be wrong about that. He mentioned that there was no need for Israel to have crops. They were about to exit and go. And so destroying all the crops in Goshen would not have hurt His people. God is looking out for His people in all of this. He did separate Goshen in several of the plagues, I think. He didn't in others, but even these devastating ones, they wouldn't have been that big a deal for Israel because they were about to go out. The other thing about that is, if He ate all the vegetation in Egypt, what would Egypt have left when Israel did leave? They couldn't just go down to Goshen and get the food that they needed. So that's some speculation, but it's interesting to think about. Luke? And we'll see that in Plague 10. You know, if somebody said your firstborn was going to die, you might take that seriously. Certainly should with God. But they were already on board with the obedience thing, as evidenced by the hail. But they brought them in, and they knew who the Lord was, or were beginning to appreciate it even more. All right, Pharaoh at the end says you can go, but only leave what? All right, leave the livestock. The other question I think on the quiz, not a what shall be left behind. Hoof. Hoof.
Well, I think that's an example right there of Moses, his growth. You know, coming from the guy out in the wilderness at Mount Sinai, being called by God, you know, send somebody else, you know, and started making up excuses. Now he is full on board with God's plan. And he's standing up against Pharaoh. He said, no, not one hoof's going to be left behind. They're all going with us.
And then the last few verses, but verse 27, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. Then Pharaoh said to him, get away from me, beware, do not see my face again. For in the day you see my face, you shall die. That's the threat from Pharaoh to Moses. And Moses is like, you got that right, buddy. We're never going to see each other again. You will not see my face. Last question. Remember the disease on livestock? It said it killed all the livestock of Egypt. But now we have the hail, and the Egyptians were instructed to bring their livestock in. Did anybody have any idea about that? Maybe, yeah.
My thought is, how long did these 10 plagues take? You know, in our minds, we're thinking, you know, just next week, you know, or a few days or whatever. I think it was longer than that. And I think it was a lot of that had time that Egyptians could send, you know, to other countries and get horses from them, camels or whatever. But certainly, yeah, they probably took a few of them from the Israelites as well.
All right, thank you.
Water did what? Yeah. You know, it reminds me of the North Korean guy. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Thank you.